1. The Haunted House. 3 powerful motorcycles sped along the shore road that leads from the city of Bayport, skirting Barmet Bay, on the Atlantic coast. It was a bright Saturday morning in June, and although the city sweltered in the heat, cool breezes blew in from the bay. 2 of the motorcycles carried an extra passenger. All the cyclists were boys of about 15 and 16 years of age, and all 5 were students at the Bayport High School. They were enjoying their Saturday holiday by this outing, glad of the chance to get away from the torrid warmth of the city for a few hours. When the foremost motorcycle reached a place where the shore road formed a junction with another highway leading to the north, the rider brought his machine to a stop and waited for the others to draw alongside. He was a tall, dark youth of 16, with a clever, good-natured face. His name was Fenton Hardy. "Where do we go from here?" he called out to the others. The 2 remaining motorcycles came to a stop and the drivers mopped their brows while the 2 other boys dismounted, glad of the chance to stretch their legs. One of the cyclists, a boy of 15, fair, with light, curly hair, was Joe Hardy, a brother of Frank's, and the other lad was Chet Morton, a chum of the Hardy boys. The other youths were Jerry Gilroy and Biff Hooper, typical, healthy American lads of high school age. "You're the leader," said Joe to his brother. "We'll follow you." "I'd rather have it settled. We've started out without any particular place to go. There's not much fun just riding around the countryside." "I don't much care where we go, as long as we keep on going," said Jerry. "We get a breeze as long as we're traveling, but the minute we stop I begin to sweat." Chet Morton gazed along the shore road. "I'll tell you what we can do," he said suddenly. "Let's go and visit the haunted house." "Palaka's place?" "Sure. We've never been out there." "I've passed it," Frank said. "But I didn't go very close to the place, I'll tell you." Jerry Gilroy, who was a newcomer to Bayport, looked puzzled. "Where is Palaka's place?" "You can see it from here. Look," said Chet, taking him by the arm and bringing him over to the side of the road. "See where the shore road dips, away out near the end of Barmet Bay. Do you see that cliff?" "Yes. There's a stone house at the top." "Well, that's Palaka's place." "Who is Palaka?" "Who was Palaka, you mean?" interjected Frank. "He used to live there. But he was murdered. And that's why the place is supposed to be haunted." "Reason enough, isn't it?" said Biff Hooper. "I don't believe in ghosts, but I'll tell the world there are some funny stories going around about that house ever since Palaka was killed." "He must have been a strange fellow, anyway," commented Jerry, "to build a house in such a place as that." Indeed, the Palaka place had been built on an unusual site. High above the waters of the bay it stood, built close to the edge of a rocky and inhospitable cliff. It was some distance back from the road, and there was no other house within miles. The boys had traveled a little more than 3 miles since leaving Bayport, and the Palaka place was at least 5 miles away. It could hardly have been seen, had it not been for its prominent position on top of the cliff, silhouetted clearly against the sky. "He was a strange fellow," Frank observed. "No one knew very much about him. He didn't welcome visitors. In fact, he always kept a couple of vicious dogs around the place, so nobody cared to hang around there if they weren't invited." "He was a miser," came from Joe Hardy. "He may have been. At least that was the theory. Everybody said Palaka had a lot of money, but after his death there wasn't a nickel found in the house. Felix Palaka always said he wouldn't trust the banks," put in Biff Hooper. "But if he had any money I don't know where he made it, for he didn't work at anything and he mighty seldom came into the city." "Perhaps he inherited it," Jerry suggested. "Maybe. He must have had money at some time to build that house. It's a great, rambling stone place that must have cost thousands." "Is anybody living there now?" The others shook their heads. No one has lived there since the murder, and I don't think anyone ever will, said Frank Hardy. The house is too far out of the way, for one thing, and then, the stories that have been going around. Well, I won't say I believe any place is haunted, but the Palukka place is certainly strange. There have been queer lights seen there at night. On stormy nights, particularly. And once a motorist had a breakdown near there, so he went up to the house for help. He didn't know anything about the history of the place. He got the scare of his life. What happened? He decided when he went into the front yard that the place was deserted, and he was just going to turn away when he saw an old man standing at one of the upper windows, looking at him. He called out, and the old man went away, and although the motorist hunted all through the house, he didn't find any trace of the old chapter. So he left that place as quickly as he could. I don't blame him, remarked Jerry. But the house sounds interesting. I'm game to visit it. So am I, declared the others. Lead on, laughed Chet. It'll be a brave ghost that will tackle the whole 5 of us. Jerry clambered on behind Chet, and Biff mounted Joe's motorcycle. The machines roared, and the little cavalcade started on its way down the shore road toward the house on the cliff. Instead of being an aimless trip, the outing had now assumed all the aspects of an adventure. With the exception of Jerry, the boys had all passed by the Palukka place at one time or another, but none had ever ventured off the main road to explore the deserted place. The lane leading into the Palukka grounds, never kept in good repair even during the owner's lifetime, was now almost indiscernible and was overgrown with weeds and bushes. The house itself was hidden from the roadway by trees. Most people gave the place a wide berth, whether they believed in ghosts or not, for the stories that had been told of the rambling stone building since the murder of Felix Palukka 2 years before were sufficient to indicate that there had been strange happenings in the old house. Whether or not they were of supernatural origin was a matter of debate. The murder of Felix Palukka had been particularly brutal. He was an old Italian, suspected, as Frank said, of being a miser. He was very eccentric in his ways, and most people considered that he was not quite sound mentally. Be that as it may, Bayport was shocked one morning to learn that the old man had been found dead in the kitchen of his house, his body riddled with bullets. The motive, apparently, was robbery, for although it was popularly believed that the old man possessed a great deal of money that he kept with him in the house, it was never found, in spite of the most diligent search. This was the gloomy history of the place the Hardy boys and their chums were now about to visit and explore. To add to the atmosphere of excitement that had possessed them from the moment the old house was mentioned, as they drew closer to the cliff, the sun retired behind a cloud and the sky gradually became darker. Frank glanced up. Although the sky had been bright and clear when the party left Bayport, clouds had gathered in the east and it was plain that a storm was gathering. Looks as if we'll have to go into the Palukka place whether we want to or not, he called out to the others. It's going to rain. In a little while they came to the lane that led to the haunted house. In spite of the fact that it was overgrown with weeds and bushes, the boys were able to drive down the faintly defined roadway until at last a rusty iron gate barred their progress. Frank, who was in the lead, got off his machine and kicked the gate open, the rusty chains clanking dismally as they fell from the staples. Then the party went on into the grounds. Under the lowering sky that heralded the approaching storm, the grounds of the Palukka place were far from inviting. Dank, tall grass grew beneath the unkempt trees, and thistles and weeds sprouted up in the very center of the roadway. A rising wind stirred among the branches of the trees and the waving grasses rustled mournfully. Creepy sort of a place, muttered Jerry. Wait till you see the house, Chet advised. Not one of them could restrain a slight shiver of apprehension when at last they came in view of the old stone building. It was framed in a mass of trees, bushes, and weeds that threatened to engulf it from all sides. Weeds obscured the front door. Bushes grew up level with the sills of the vacant downstairs windows. Trees on either side and beyond the house extended trailing branches down over the roof. A shutter hung by one hinge from an upstairs window, and banged with every passing gust of wind. A death-like silence hung over the old building. Under the black clouds that now filled the entire sky, it was imbued with an atmosphere of gloom and terror. "Come on," said Frank. "Now that we're here, we may as well go through the place." "Haven't seen any ghosts yet," laughed Chet, with an effort at being light-hearted. But in spite of himself, his tone seemed forced. They left the motorcycles beneath a tree and advanced toward the old stone building. The front door was almost off its hinges, and it swung creakingly open at Frank's touch. Frank stepped boldly into the hallway. The interior of the house was veiled in gloom, for the rear windows were boarded up, but the lads could see that everything was deep in dust. A staircase was before them, leading to the upper stories of the building. To the left was a closed door. "This must be the parlor," said Frank, as he flung the door open. The room was empty. A stone fireplace was at one side, and as the boys came into the room, a rat scuttled out of the fireplace and raced across the floor, disappearing through a hole in the wall. The sound made everyone jump, for the boys' nerves were at a tension on account of the forbidding atmosphere. "Just a rat," said Frank. His voice had the effect of calming the others. They stood hesitantly in the middle of the deserted parlor. Joe went over to the window and looked out, but the view from the front window of the Palooka place was so lonely and gruesome, in its aspect of tangled trees and weeds and undergrowth under the lowering darkness of the sky, that he came back. "Where shall we go next?" said Chet. "Nothing much to see around here," said Frank, disappointed. "It's just an ordinary, dirty, old, deserted house. Let's explore upstairs, anyway." At that moment there was a startling interruption. A weird shriek, quavering as if with terror, rang out from the upper part of the haunted house. 2. The storm. That shriek was the most fearful and uncanny sound the boys had ever heard. There was a diabolical malignance about it, like the scream of some bloodthirsty animal, yet there was no mistaking the fact that it was uttered by a human being. As the quavering notes died away, the bare walls of the old house flung back the echoes so that the shriek seemed to be repeated again and again, but on a smaller scale. The boys stared at one another, aghast. For a moment they were dumbfounded. Then Jerry muttered, "I'm getting out of here," and with that, he started for the door. "Me too," declared Biff Hooper, and Chet Morton followed him as he rushed for the doorway. "What's the big idea?" asked Frank, standing his ground. "Let's stay and find what this is all about." Joe, seeing his brother remain where he was, made no move to follow the others, although it was plain that the weird shriek had unnerved him. "You can stay," flung back Jerry. "I'm not. This place is haunted, and I don't mean maybe." The three boys hastened through the doorway out into the hall and lost no time in regaining the front yard. Frank and Joe Hardy listened to their retreating footsteps. Frank shrugged his shoulders. "I guess it gave them a pretty bad scare," he said to his brother. "We may as well go with them." "I guess so," replied Joe, greatly relieved. They were alone in the gloomy and deserted old house, and as they stepped into the hallway, Joe cast a cautious glance up the stairway. But there was nothing to be seen. The upper floor was veiled in shadow. The house was in silence that seemed even heavier than before. When the two Hardy boys got outside, they found the others waiting for them in the shelter of some trees about 100 yards from the house. The three were discussing the strange occurrence in excited tones, and when the Hardy boys came up to them, Jerry said, "I don't have to be convinced any further. The place is haunted, sure. No other way to explain it." "There's not much sense in running away from a sound," remarked Frank lightly. "If we had seen something, it might be different. I don't believe in ghosts and I'd like to get to the bottom of this. It's foolish to run away. Let's go back." Chet Morton and Biff Hooper looked a trifle ashamed of themselves because of their precipitous flight from the house while the Hardy boys had remained. "I got the scare of my life," Chet confessed. "Just the same, I'm game to go back if you want to." "How about you, Biff?" Biff Hooper scratched his head reflectively. "I'm none too anxious to go back in there again," he admitted. "Not that I'm scared, of course," he added hastily. "But I don't see where we'd learn anything, anyway." "Well, Joe and I are going back. That's settled," declared Frank. "We want to get to the bottom of this mystery." "Mysteries are your meat," observed Biff. "Well, when you come to think of it, this is a good chance for a little detective work." He alluded to the fact that the Hardy boys were amateur detectives of some renown in Bayport. They came by their gift naturally, for their father, Fenton Hardy, had been for years on the detective staff of the New York police. Of late years he had been living in Bayport conducting a private detective service of his own with great success. He was known from one end of the country to the other as an exceptionally brilliant investigator. Frank and Joe Hardy, his sons, were ambitious to follow in their father's footsteps, although their mother wished them to prepare themselves for medicine and the law respectively. But the lure of Fenton Hardy's calling was persistent, and the two boys were bent on proving to their parents that they were capable of becoming first-class detectives. They had given proof of this already by helping their father in a small way on a number of cases, but their first big success had been achieved when they solved the mystery of a jewel and bond robbery from Tower Mansion in Bayport. The story of this has been related in the first and preceding volume of this series, The Hardy Boys, The Tower Treasure, wherein was recounted how the Hardy boys solved the mystery of the robbery when the Bayport police and even Fenton Hardy himself were baffled. "I'd rather tackle a good mystery than eat," laughed Frank. "And here is one right to hand. Let's go back." Biff Hooper did not care to seem guilty of cowardice by staying behind while his companions returned to the house, and he was on the point of a reluctant consent when the matter was suddenly solved for them all by a downpour of rain. Storm clouds had been gathering in the sky for the past hour and there had been dull rumblings of thunder. Now an uneasy wind stirred the branches of the trees and rustled dismally among the undergrowth. There was a spatter of raindrops, and then the storm broke in abrupt violence. Rain poured down in sheets. "The motorcycles," cried Frank. Turning up their coat collars, the boys ran through the thick grass until they reached the place where their machines had been parked. "I saw an old shed near the house," called out Joe. "We can put the bikes under cover." There was an abandoned wagon shed near the rear of the house, and toward this refuge the lads trundled the heavy motorcycles. Although the shed was almost falling to pieces, the roof was still in fairly good condition and the machines were safe from the downpour. "Come on," said Frank, when the motorcycles had been placed under cover. "Let's go back into the house." He led the way, running across the open space from the shed, through the driving rain, and Joe followed. The others, after a moment of hesitation, came after them. The back door of the house was open and the lads ran up the steps into the shelter of the building. They were in a room that had evidently been used as a kitchen, and although rain came in slanting streaks through the open windows, the glass of which had long since been shattered, they were at least sheltered from the downpour that had assumed redoubled violence. The rain drummed on the roof of the old house and poured from black skies on the nearby wagon shed. Thunder rolled and rumbled threateningly, and every once in a while a sheet of lightning tore a band of lurid light across the gloom. Chet took off his cap, which was drenched, and tried to dry it out. The others stood by the window, looking out at the terrific downpour. Then came the second shriek. It rang out suddenly, at a time when none of the lads was talking, and it was a replica of the first, a quavering, long drawn-out yell that seemed to freeze the blood in their veins. No sooner had it died away than there came a terrific clap of thunder, and then the rain seemed to beat down on the roof of the old house in a frenzy. In the gloomy, dusty kitchen, the boys stared at one another. Frank broke the silence. "I'm going to find out about this," he declared firmly, striding over to the door that led to the interior of the house. "Me too," said Joe. Taking heart by the Hardy boys' example, the others crowded at their heels. Frank flung open the door and strode into the room beyond. It was a very gloomy chamber, for the one window was boarded up, but when their eyes became accustomed to the meager light, the boys saw that a door on the far side of the room led into a hallway. It was evidently not the hallway that they had already been in at the front of the house, but presumably one that led to a side door. "Nothing here," said Frank. "I'd like to find those stairs." That yell came from the upper part of the house. The boys made their way across the room. Outside they could hear the sweep of the rain and the steady rumblings of the thunder, for the storm was now at its height. Through the chinks of the boards over the window they could occasionally see the lurid glare of lightning. Suddenly there was a blast of wind that seemed to shake the entire house. A sharp, violent noise immediately behind them made every boy jump with surprise. They wheeled about. The door behind them had been blown shut. Biff Hooper, who was nearest, grasped the knob and tried to open it. He wrenched and tugged at the door, but it remained obstinate. "We're locked in," he muttered. "We can get out, all right," said Frank. "There must be a door in this side hall." He walked across the room and entered the hallway. At the same instant a maniacal howl rang through the old house. The hollow echoes magnified its volume. A flash of lightning illuminated the startled faces of the 5 boys. With one accord they rushed into the hallway. It was a narrow place, heavy with dust, and their feet thudded heavily on the moldy flooring. Crash! At the far end of the hall they had a glimpse of falling plaster that fell in a great heap to the floor. A dense cloud of dust arose and filled the narrow chamber. "Run for your lives," yelled Frank. But no sooner were the words out of his mouth than there came a ripping, crackling sound from overhead. Immediately above them, a large part of the ceiling, disturbed no doubt by the vibrations of their feet as they ran into the hall, had given way. A wide crack that showed in the plaster quickly became wider, and then, with a terrific roar, half the hall ceiling came tumbling down upon the lads. They were buried in dust and laths and plaster that came upon them in such an avalanche that they were thrown to the floor. The splintering of wood and ominous crackling that followed indicated that more of the ceiling was about to go, and then came a roar even louder than the first, as another avalanche of debris rolled down upon them. Was the Palaka house falling in? 3. Empty toolboxes. When he was knocked off his feet by the impact of falling debris, Frank Hardy crouched down, protecting his head as well as possible, until the downfall was over. Although a great deal of rubbish descended, it was not heavy material, and when at last the rain of plaster and splintered laths had ceased, Frank knew that he was uninjured, although he was almost buried in the heap and half smothered by the thick dust that rose all about him. He managed to get to his feet, fighting his way clear of the rubbish, and the first sight that met his eyes was an arm, sticking out of the debris nearby. He seized the outstretched hand and dragged the owner to safety, discovering that it was his brother Joe. By this time the others were beginning to extricate themselves, and within a few minutes all 5 boys, covered with dust from head to foot, had scrambled out to the clear floor in the middle of the hall. No one was injured, although Joe and Jerry complained of bruises about the head and shoulders. "Let's get out of here," exclaimed Chet, as soon as he could get his breath. "I'm not going to fool around this house any longer." He looked about him for some means of escape. "I don't think it's very healthy myself," Frank agreed. He saw a door at the side of the hall and, going over, tried to open it. But the door was locked fast, and although he kicked at it and shoved against the panels with all his strength, he was unable to budge it. "There's a window," declared Joe. "Let's break our way out." The window was boarded over, but the glass was already shattered, so Chet and Jerry, picking up rocks that had tumbled down in the debris from the walls and ceiling, pounded at the boards. "We'd better keep moving," advised Biff Hooper. "Perhaps the rest of the place will start caving in on us." There was a splintering sound as one of the boards fell loose, revealing the rain-soaked trees and bushes outside. Another onslaught with the rocks and another board fell away, leaving a space sufficient to admit of the passage of a human body. "Gee, that looks good to me. Let's get out of here quick." "That suits me. Don't lose any time, this whole building may be coming down." As the last words were uttered, the boys heard another crash behind them. It was so close that it made all of them jump. "Hurry up, everybody," yelled Biff Hooper. "Can't get out any too fast for me," returned Jerry. "You said it," muttered Chet. One by one the boys scrambled up on the window sill and squeezed their way out between the boards until at last all were standing outside the old house. The storm was still raging. Rain poured down in a drenching torrent. "Now let's get as far away from this place as we can travel," said Jerry. "Somebody is going to get killed if we stick around here much longer." He was pale with fright, and it was plain that the strange experiences of the past hour had completely unnerved him. "That's the way I feel about it," agreed Biff Hooper. "I'm not a bit comfortable around here. Let's beat it." "I'd like to find out what is wrong with the place," persisted Frank doggedly. "You couldn't drag me back in there with a team of horses," objected Chet. "Let's clear out. I've had enough of it." "Come on," urged Jerry. "There's no use going back. The whole place will cave in on us if we aren't careful. And, anyway, there's something fishy about the house." Frank saw that the others were determined on leaving, in spite of the pouring rain, so, reluctantly, he gave in, and the 5 boys hastened around the side of the house over to the shed where they had left the motorcycles. "We can at least stay in the shed until the rain goes over," he said. "Not on your life," declared Chet Morton. "I'm going to put as much distance between little me and that haunted house as I can. That place gets on my nerves." And with that he began tinkering with the machine, preparatory to starting it. Frank and Joe decided that no good would be served by arguing the matter, so they prepared to leave with the others, although they privately resolved to return to the Palooka place at the earliest opportunity, to investigate the mystery of the house on the cliff more thoroughly. Jerry and Biff Hooper took their places, and in a few minutes the 3 motorcycles drove slowly out of the shed and across the yard toward the lane. It was then that they heard the laugh. From the haunted house came a harsh, mocking laugh that rang out in peals of derisive merriment. It continued for several seconds, and could be heard quite plainly even above the noise of the engines and the drumming of the rain on the roof. Then it stopped, abruptly. The boys looked at one another. "Did you hear someone laugh?" asked Frank, unable to believe his ears. "You bet I did," exclaimed Chet. "And that does settle it. I'm leaving here right away." "That was the most nerve-wracking laugh I ever heard in my life," declared Jerry. "Let's get out of here, quick." "Somebody's playing a joke on us," Frank said angrily. "I'm going back." "Joke? Nothing. That place is haunted. Come on." And with a roar, Chet's motorcycle leaped forward as he headed down the lane toward the main road. Joe, after looking behind and motioning to his brother to stay with the party, followed him. Soon the three motorcycles were speeding down the lane. And from the haunted house came peal after peal of that same demoniacal laughter, as though mocking their flight. Then, as they rode on through the streaming rain and the haunted house was lost to sight among the wet and sodden trees, the laughter died away. When they reached the main road, the boys turned their motorcycles in the direction of Bayport, and for more than 5 minutes the machines rocked and swerved as they sped along through the muddy ruts. The boys were soaked to the skin and water dripped from the peaks of their caps into their eyes. The rain poured down with redoubled violence and the others could scarcely see Chet's machine through the misty downpour. Chet was making such good time back to Bayport that they found it difficult to keep up with him. Frank Hardy was still dissatisfied. He had really wanted to remain behind and probe the mystery of the house on the cliff further. He held no stock in the ghost theory. The shrieks and the mocking laugh, he was sure, were of human origin. But what could have been the motive? It may have been that some boys had been in the house when they arrived and had simply seized the opportunity to play a joke on them. In that case, he muttered to himself, the story will be all over the Bayport High School by Monday and we'll be kidded within an inch of our lives for running away. We should have stayed behind. Something told him, however, that this was no ordinary schoolboy prank. The incident of the fallen ceiling had unnerved him slightly. It was only by good luck that none of them had been seriously hurt. Of course, it may have been entirely accidental, but it seemed to have happened at a strangely opportune time. Then the recollection of the shrieks and the mocking laugh came back to him again and he shivered as he recalled the maniacal intensity of the tones. If it was any fellow like ourselves, he was a mighty good actor, Frank said to himself. I've heard of a person's blood running cold, but I never knew what it meant until I heard those yells. Suddenly his motorcycle began, as he termed it, acting up. It coughed, lurched, backfired explosively, and then the engine died. What a fine time for a breakdown, Frank said, as he dismounted. Joe drew up alongside. What's the matter? He called. Engine broke down. Gosh, aren't you lucky? Exclaimed Joe, grinning. There's a shed over at the side of the road. Bring it over under cover. He pointed to a tumble-down shed nearby. Frank realized that it might take some time to discover the trouble, so he trundled the motorcycle over to the refuge his brother had indicated. In the meantime, Chet Morton had looked back, to find that the others were not following him, and had decided to return. The roar of his machine could be heard through the rain as he rode back toward them. In the shelter of the shed, Frank first of all took off his coat and cap, which were dripping wet, and hung them up on a projecting board. Then, as Joe and Jerry stood by, glad of the chance to get in out of the rain, he rolled up his sleeves and prepared to find the source of the trouble. They could hear Chet calling for them, as he drove along the road in the rain. Thinks we're lost, laughed Joe. He went over to the front of the shed and hailed their companion. Come on up here, he shouted. Had a breakdown. Grumbling audibly, Chet dismounted and came over toward the shed. In the meantime, Frank had opened the toolbox of his motorcycle. The others were startled by a sudden exclamation. Frank was staring at the toolbox, with a bewildered expression on his face. My tools, he exclaimed. They're gone. The other boys crowded around. The toolbox was empty. Did you have them when you left Bayport? Asked Joe. Of course I did. I never go anywhere without them. Who on earth could have taken them? You can have mine, offered Joe, going over to his own motorcycle. He snapped open the toolbox on his machine and then gave a shout of astonishment. Mine are gone too. 4. The chase in the bay. The boys stared at one another in bewilderment. I know my toolbox was full when I left home, said Frank. And so was mine, came from Joe. I was using the pliers just before we started out. Where could they have gone? They must have been stolen while the motorcycles were in the shed at the Palaka place, Chet suggested. It's the only time they could have been taken, declared Frank. It was the only time they were left unguarded. Joe was frankly puzzled. But we didn't see anyone around the place, said Jerry. No, but there was someone there. We heard those shrieks and the laugh. Someone stole those tools while we were in the house. It's some kind of a practical joke, that's what I'm beginning to think, declared Frank. Let's go back and get those tools. Not on your life, objected Jerry decisively. This is a little too much. First of all we hear those shrieks, and then the house almost comes down around our ears, and now we find that the tools have been stolen by somebody we didn't see. We're safer away from there. Biff Hooper nodded agreement. That's what I think. There's something queer about that house. We'll get into trouble if we go butting in any more. But we want our tools. Good night, Chet exclaimed. Perhaps mine are gone too. He ran out of the shed over to the road and hastily examined the toolbox on his machine. Then he straightened up with an audible sigh of relief. Thank goodness, they're here. Guess whoever took the others figured he had enough. I'm going back, declared Frank. If you do, you'll have to excuse me, Chet said. You're welcome to use my tools to fix up your machine, but I won't go back with you. Me neither, chimed in Jerry and Biff simultaneously. Frank and Joe were silent. They wanted to go back to the Palaka place and investigate the matter further, but they did not want to break up the party, so they decided it would be better policy to remain with their companions. All right, Frank said. Lend me a pair of pliers and I'll have this trouble fixed up in no time. He went over to Chet's motorcycle and got the desired tools. Then he began to tinker with his machine. It was only a minor defect, and a few minutes' work sufficed to repair the damage. In the meantime it was apparent that the rain was letting up, and by the time the Hardy boys took their motorcycles out of the shed and regained the road, it had died away to a mere drizzle. This has been some holiday, Chet muttered, as he mounted his machine again. I'm going home. Jerry, you and Biff had better come up to our place for dinner. How about you and Joe, Frank? Thanks just the same, but we couldn't. We promised to be back home this afternoon. There's a side road that turns off here that makes a nice shortcut to our farm. I guess I'll go that way. There should be room for 3 on this bike, with a little crowding. Jerry and Biff Hooper clambered on the motorcycle with Chet Morton and started off. The Hardy boys followed on their own machines until they reached the side road, about 100 yards away. There the others left them, after shouting goodbye. Frank and Joe watched Chet's motorcycle, heavily loaded, disappear into the mists that hovered over the road, and then they prepared to continue their journey back to Bayport. The shore road dipped at that point and wound down along the edge of the bay in a deep spiral, which brought them at one point almost back to the cliff at the top of which the Palukka place was located, although by now they were nearer the water's edge. From there the road sloped directly down to the shore, then ran along the edge of the bay and in toward the city. Frank looked up toward the top of the cliff that loomed high above them. They could not see the Palukka place from where they were, as it was on the high ground and almost masked by trees, but the mystery of the place still preyed on their minds. "I'd like to go back there yet," said Frank suddenly. "That affair of the tools has me guessing." "Me too. But I think we'd better go on home. We can come back some other time and look for them. One minute I think it was only a practical joke of some kind. And the next minute I think it's something a whole lot deeper than that. There's something strange going on up there." There were sure a lot of strange things going on when we struck the place, that's certain. I can hear those shrieks yet. "Well, I guess you're right, Joe. We may as well go on home. But I'd like to get to the bottom of it. Whoever stole those tools made quick work of it. We weren't in the house very long. It proves that it wasn't a ghost, anyway." I never did believe in the ghost theory. No, some human being took those tools. And he was watching us, too. He saw us put the bikes in the shed and he took the tools while we were in the house. Unless they were taken after we left the bikes under the trees in the first place. He wouldn't have had time. We only stepped into the front room and then we all came out after that first shriek. No, the tools were taken when the bikes were in the shed. The boys rode on. The rain had ceased now, but the road was greasy and they had to call on all their skill to keep from skidding as they drove down the steep road toward the bay, so they did not talk again until they reached the more level highway at the shore. A sound out in the bay attracted Frank's attention and he looked out over the rolling sweep of waters. He could see a powerful motorboat plunging through the waves about a quarter of a mile out. It was just coming into view around the base of the cliff, and as Frank looked he saw the nose of still another boat emerging into sight. Each craft was traveling at high speed. "Looks like a race," remarked Joe. The Hardy boys stopped their motorcycles and watched the two boats. But it was soon apparent that this was no friendly speed contest. The boat in the lead was zigzagging in a peculiar manner, and the pursuing craft was rapidly overhauling it. The staccato roar of the powerful boats was borne to the lads' ears by the wind. "See, the other boat is chasing it," Frank exclaimed. He had caught sight of the figures of two men standing in the bow of the pursuing craft. They were waving their arms frantically. The first boat turned as though it were about to head inshore at the cliff and then, apparently, the helmsman changed his mind, for at once the nose of the boat pointed out into the open bay again. But the moment of hesitation had given the pursuers the chance they wanted, and swiftly the gap between the racing craft grew smaller and smaller. The Hardy boys saw that there was but one man in the foremost craft. He was bent over the wheel. In the other boat they caught sight of one figure who had snatched up an object that appeared to be a rifle. To their amazement they saw him aim at the man in the leading craft. Then, across the water, they heard the sharp report. The lone figure in the first boat dropped out of sight. Whether he had been hit or not the boys could not tell. But the craft did not slacken speed. Instead, it still continued to race madly through the waves. But the pursuers rapidly drew closer until at last the boats were running side by side. They were so close together that it appeared as if a collision were imminent. "The whole crowd of them will be killed if they aren't careful," muttered Frank. Then, just when it seemed that both boats must crash together, the pursuing craft, as though it had given up the chase, veered abruptly away and headed out toward the middle of the bay. The speed of the other boat decreased. The roar of its exhaust became intermittent. "Engine trouble," suggested Joe. But there was more than engine trouble. With startling violence, a sheet of flame leaped high into the air from the motorboat. There was a stunning explosion and a dense puff of smoke. Bits of wreckage were thrown high into the air, and in the midst of it all the Hardy boys, horrified, saw the figure of the man they had noticed before, as he was hurled into the water. The whole boat was swiftly ablaze. Hardly had the wreckage begun to fall back into the water with spasmodic patterings and splashes than the craft was in flames from bow to stern. "Look," shouted Frank. "He's still alive." The man of the boat had been killed by neither the rifle shot nor the explosion. They could see him struggling in the water not far from the blazing craft. His head was a dark oval above the water and he was slowly trying to swim ashore. "He'll never make it," gasped Joe. "We'll have to try to save him," answered his brother. The rescue. The Hardy boys knew that they had no time to lose. It was evident from the struggles of the man in the water that he was not an expert swimmer. So far, he had not seen the boys, but they could hear him shouting for help, possibly thinking, however, that it was in vain, for it was a lonely part of the bay and the nearest farmhouse, outside of the deserted Palooka place, was more than half a mile down the road. "Quick," shouted Frank. "I see a rowboat up on the shore." His sharp eyes had discerned a small boat almost hidden in a little cove some distance away at the bottom of a steep declivity that was the beginning of the cliff. It could not be reached by going along the shore, and the boys saw that they would have to go along the high ground and then descend to it, for a huge rock that jutted out of the deep water cut the cove off from the more open part of the beach. They left their motorcycles on the side of the road and hurried back up the slope, then cut down across a narrow strip of weeds and grass until they came to the top of the declivity. They could still see the victim of the explosion struggling in the waves. The man had seized a piece of wreckage and was able to remain afloat, but the boys knew it was only a matter of time before his strength would give out. "Looks to be almost all in," remarked Frank. "I wonder if his anybody we know," came from his brother. "It isn't likely." Frank reached out suddenly and caught hold of Joe's arm. "Look out there or you may break a leg." "It certainly is mighty slippery," answered Joe, as he managed to regain his footing. He had come close to going heels over head on the rocks. Slipping and scrambling, they made their way down the slope toward the little cove. Rocks went rolling and tumbling ahead of them. The distance was only a few yards, but the slope was steep and a false step might result in broken bones. But they reached the bottom in safety and there they came upon the rowboat. It was battered and old, but evidently still seaworthy. "Into the water with her," said Frank. They seized the boat and the keel grated on the shingle as the little craft was launched. Swiftly, they fixed the oars in the locks and then they scrambled into their places. They began to row with strong, steady strokes out toward the man in the bay. He had seen them, and was now shouting to them to hurry. "He'd be better off if he kept quiet," Joe said. "He's only wasting his strength." Evidently this thought occurred to the victim of the wreck, or else he was becoming weaker, for his cries died away and the boys did not hear him again. Frank thought he may have gone beneath the waves, and he cast a quick look around. But the fellow was still in view, clinging desperately to his bit of wreckage. The motorboat in the background was still blazing fiercely. Flames were shooting high in the air and the craft was plainly doomed. A great pillar of smoke was rolling into the sky from the burning boat. As for the other motorboat, Frank could hear the roar of its exhaust as it continued its flight out into the bay. For a while he could see its dim shape, when he turned around once in a while, but then the fleeing boat disappeared into the mist and the gloom. The boys exerted all their strength and the little rowboat fairly leaped over the waves. Both were good oarsmen and it was not long before they had drawn close to the man in the water. But it looked as though they would be too late. When they were only a few yards away, Frank looked around, to shout encouragement to the victim of the wreck. Even as he looked, he saw the man wearily give up his grasp on the piece of wreckage to which he had been clinging. Frank had a glimpse of the white face and the despairing eyes, and then the man sank slowly beneath the waves. "He's drowning, Joe," shouted Frank, as he bent to his oar again. With a mighty effort, they brought the boat close by the place where the man had gone down. Frank leaped to the side of the boat and peered down into the depths. He began taking off his coat, preparatory to diving to the rescue. Then the fellow came to the surface again, gasping for breath, but so weak that he could scarcely make a struggle. He emerged from the water, right beside the boat, and Frank leaned over, grasping him by the hair. This sufficed to prevent the man from sinking for the second time, and Frank managed to get a grip on the collar of his coat. Then, with Joe helping and in imminent danger of upsetting the boat, he managed to drag the stranger to the side of the craft. The fellow was a dead weight, for he had lapsed into unconsciousness when Frank seized him, but somehow they contrived to get him into the boat, and there he lay, sprawled helplessly, more dead than alive. "We'd better get him to shelter someplace and revive him," said Joe. "We can't do much for him here." "How about that farmhouse down the bay?" "The very place. Where is it?" They finally located the farmhouse, a snug little building back off the main road some distance down the bay. It meant considerable rowing, but there was a life at stake. The blazing motorboat nearby was a roaring mass of flames. Then it began to sink beneath the waves. There was a great hissing sound and a heavy cloud of steam as the craft sank lower and lower into the water, its blazing embers blackening to the touch of the sea. Swiftly, at last, the boat disappeared. Its stern seemed to hesitate for a moment, and then it slid quickly down into the waves, and the only trace was a widening pool of oil and scattered wreckage on the surface of the water. But the Hardy boys were too busy to give more than passing notice to the spectacle. Their immediate problem was to get the stranger under shelter. Frank decided that there was no necessity for first aid. The man had been conscious when he rose from the water the first time, so there could not be much water in his lungs. He had simply given in to exhaustion and fatigue resulting from his long struggle in the waves. They headed the boat down the bay, in a direct line with the little farmhouse, which they could see nestling among the trees. They had already spent much energy in rowing out to the rescue of the stranger, but they fell to the new task with a will. Rowing with machine-like precision, they felt the little boat respond to every effort, and it fairly leaped along. This time they had the wind and the waves with them, and they made good time. The man they had rescued lay face downward in the bottom of the boat. He was a slim, black-haired fellow. His clothes, which of course were soaked with water, were cheap and worn, the sleeves being frayed at the cuffs. They could not see his face, but they judged him to be young. He was still unconscious. Frank let Joe take his oar for a moment, and crouched down beside the stranger. He turned the man over, and the limp form lolled about as helplessly as a bag of salt. As they had surmised, he was a young fellow, with sharp, clean-cut features. He wore a cheap shirt, open at the throat. Frank pressed his ear to the fellow's chest and listened for signs of life. Finally he straightened up, with a mutter of satisfaction. "His heart's beating all right," he told Joe. "He's alive, at any rate. Just all in. He'll come to after a while." He returned to his oar and the little boat skimmed over the waves on toward the farmhouse in the distance. The boys rowed until the muscles of their arms were aching, but at last they drew near the shore and finally the pebbles grated underneath the keel. Frank leaped out and dragged the boat part way up on the beach. Then, between them, they carried the unconscious man up the rocky shore toward the farmhouse. They found a path that led through a field up to the back door of the house, and although their burden was heavy they managed to carry the still figure, limp and motionless, across the field. A gaunt, kindly-faced woman came hurrying out of the house at their approach, and from the orchard nearby came a man in overalls. The farmer and his wife had seen them. "Laws, what's happened now?" asked the woman, wide-eyed, as they came up to her. "This man was mighty nearly drowned out in the bay," explained Frank. "We saw your house." "Bring him in," boomed the farmer. "Bring him indoors." The woman ran ahead of them and held the door open. With the farmer giving aid, The boys carried the unconscious man into the house and placed him on a couch in the comfortably furnished living room. The farmer's wife glanced dubiously at the stream of water that dripped from the victim's clothes, for she was a tidy soul and she had just scrubbed the floor that morning, but her better nature overcame her housewifely instincts and she hastened out to the kitchen to prepare a hot drink. "Best rub his hands," suggested the farmer. He was a burly man with a black beard. "It'll bring the blood back to his cheeks. One of you take off his boots and we'll wrap his feet up in warm flannels." For the next 5 minutes the house was a scene of excitement as the farmer and his wife bustled about and the Hardy boys rubbed industriously at the hands and feet of the unconscious man, trying to restore him to consciousness. At last there was a sign of reviving life. The man on the couch stirred feebly. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved, but no words came. Then the eyes opened and the man stared at them, as though in a daze. "Where am I?" he muttered faintly. "You're safe," Frank assured him. "You're with friends." "Pretty near cashed in, didn't I?" "Yes, you pretty nearly drowned. But you're all right now." "It was Snackley," said the stranger, as though talking to himself. "Snackley got me, the rat." 6. Snackley. At that moment the farmer's wife appeared, bringing a drink of hot ginger and water, which the man on the couch gulped down gratefully. "We'll put him in the spare room, Mabel," decided the farmer. "He needs a good warm bed more'n anything else just now. I'll look after him, if these boys here will help me." I think I was shot," muttered the stranger. He motioned weakly toward his side. Frank leaned over. "Why, there's blood on his coat," he exclaimed. A hasty examination showed that the stranger was right. There was a bullet wound in his right side. It was evidently not serious, merely a flesh wound, but it had bled freely and the man was weakened. Gently, the boys helped remove his clothing, and with warm water and a sponge the farmer bathed the wound. The bullet had passed right through the fellow's coat after searing a path across his side. Disinfectant was then applied, the stranger gritting his teeth with pain, and after that the bandages were put in place. "Now we can put him to bed. Can you walk, stranger?" The man made an effort to rise, and then fell back weakly upon the couch. "I'm afraid I can't." "All right, then, we'll carry you. Give me a hand with him, lads." Between them, they carried the wounded man upstairs into a plain but comfortably furnished room. Here he was put to bed and covered with warm blankets. With a sigh of relief, he closed his eyes. "He's weak from loss of blood. That's mostly what's the matter with him," the farmer said. "We'll let him have a good sleep." They left the room, and when they went out into the kitchen again the Hardy boys told the farmer and his wife of the strange adventure they had just been through. The farmer listened thoughtfully. "Queer," he observed. "Mighty queer." Then, glancing significantly at his wife, he said, "What do you think of it, Mabel?" "I think the same as you, Bill, and you know it. Most like it's been another of them smuggling mix-ups." The farmer nodded. "I've an idea it's something like that." "Smuggling," exclaimed Frank. "Sure. There's quite a bit of smuggling goes on around Barmet Bay, you know. Leastways, there has been in the past few months. That's been my suspicions, anyway. I've seen too many motorboats out in the bay of late, and I've heard too many of 'em prowlin' around at night. If it's not smugglin', it's some other kind of unlawful business." "Do you think this fellow may have been shot in some kind of a smuggler's quarrel?" The farmer shrugged. Maybe. I ain't saying nothing. It ain't safe to say anything when you don't know for certain. But I wouldn't be a mite surprised." Mr. and Mrs. Kane, as they introduced themselves, were just about to have dinner, and they invited the Hardy boys to stay. This the lads were glad to do, as they were very tired by their exertions of the morning, and were already feeling the pangs of hunger. They sat down to the simple but ample meal, typical farm fare of roast beef and baked pork and beans, with creamy mashed potatoes, topped off with a rich lemon pie, frothy with meringue, and fragrant coffee. During the meal they discussed the strange affair of the bay. The Hardy boys did not mention their experiences at the Palaka place, for they had learned that one of the chief requisites of a good detective is to keep his ears open and his mouth shut and to hear more than he tells. At that, one mystery was enough for one dinner. "I'd like to find out more about this affair," said Frank, when the meal was concluded and Mr. Kane sat back luxuriously in his chair and puffed at his pipe. "Perhaps that fellow is awake now. Wouldn't do any harm to see. You might ask him some questions. I'm just as curious about it as you are yourself." They went upstairs. The stranger was sleeping when they looked into the room, but the slight noise they made awakened him and he gazed at them dully. "Feeling better?" Joe asked. "Oh, yes," replied the stranger weakly. "I must have lost a lot of blood, though." "That was when they shot at you just before the boat blew up," said Frank. The man in the bed nodded, but said nothing. "What's your name, stranger?" asked Mr. Kane bluntly. The man in the bed hesitated a moment. "Jones," he said, at last. It was so evidently a false name that the Hardy boys glanced at one another, and the farmer scratched his chin doubtfully. "How come you to be in such a mess as this?" he asked, at last. "What were they shooting at you for?" "Don't ask me, please," said the mysterious Jones. "I can't tell you. I can't tell you anything." "I suppose you know these young fellas saved your life?" "Yes, I know, and I'm very grateful. But don't ask me any questions. I can't tell you anything about it." "You won't even tell them? Not after they saved your life?" Jones shook his head stubbornly. "I can't explain anything about it. Please go away. Let me sleep." Frank and Joe signaled to the farmer that it would be best if they withdrew, so they left the room and closed the door. When they went back downstairs, the farmer was grumbling to himself. "I'm hanged if he ain't the most close-mouthed lad I've ever seen," he declared. "You saved his life and he won't tell you why he come to be ricin' around the bay in a motorboat with fellows shootin' at him. He must have some good reason. It's his own business, after all," reflected Frank. "We can't force him to explain anything. He's in with them smugglers, that's what he is," declared Mr. Kane, with conviction. "I guess we had better be getting back home. Do you mind keeping him here? We can have him moved to a hospital." The farmer shook his head. "Smuggler or not, he stays here until he gets better. Nobody ever said Bill Kane turned a sick man out of doors, and nobody ever will. He stays here until he gets better. We'll come back in a day or so and see how he is getting along," Joe promised. "He'll have the best of care here. Whether it's smuggling or not that he's been mixed up in, it doesn't matter. My wife and I will look after him." The Hardy boys arranged to have the rowboat returned to its mooring place, then took their leave of the good-hearted farmer and his wife and made their way out to the road. Then they went back to the place where they had left their motorcycles, and in a short while were speeding again on their return to Bayport. "That fellow is certainly a queer stick," remarked Joe, as he and his brother motored toward home. "I'll say he is," answered Frank. "There's something mighty queer about all this, and don't you forget it." It was mid-afternoon when they turned their motorcycles into the driveway beside the Hardy home, and after they had put the machines in the garage they went into the house. They found their father, Fenton Hardy, in his den just off the library. He was never too busy to talk to his sons, and when they came in he put down the papers he was studying and leaned back in his chair. "Well, what have you two been up to today?" he inquired, smiling. "We've had a real adventure, this time, Dad," Frank told him. "We were out to the old Palaka place with some of the fellows." "That's the haunted house, isn't it? See any ghosts?" The boys looked at one another. "No, we didn't see any ghosts, exactly," said Joe. "But you don't mean to tell me you heard some?" Fenton Hardy threw back his head and laughed with delight. "You may laugh, but some mighty queer things happened out there," insisted Joe. Whereupon the brothers told their father of the strange experiences at the deserted farmhouse. But Mr. Hardy refused to take them seriously. "Some of your school chums playing a joke on you," he said, dismissing the affair. "They'll be laughing their heads off about it right now." "But how do you account for the toolboxes being robbed?" "They just did that to make it a little more mysterious. Probably they will hand you back your tools at school on Monday, just to prove their story." This aspect of the situation had not occurred to the boys. They began to look a bit sheepish. If it had been the work of practical jokers, it was only natural that they would seek something definite whereby to prove the fact that they had been at the farmhouse. "Gosh, we'll never hear the end of it, if that's the case," sighed Joe. "Oh, well, we'll just have to take it in good part. But we didn't tell you about what happened on the way home. Tell him about it, Frank." "Another adventure?" "A real one. No practical joke about this." Frank thereupon told their father about the 2 motorboats in Barmet Bay, about the chase and the resulting explosion. He modestly underestimated their own part in the rescue of the victim of the wreck, but Fenton Hardy nodded his head in satisfaction as the story went on. Good work, he muttered. "You saved the fellow's life, anyway. And it looks as though you've stumbled on a mysterious bit of business in that motorboat chase. What did the man say his name was?" "Jones," answered Frank doubtfully. Fenton Hardy raised his eyebrows. "Of course, there are lots of Joneses in the world. It might be his real name, but more than likely it isn't. Would he tell you anything about the reason for the chase? Did you question him?" "He wouldn't tell us anything at all. We made a few inquiries, but he said he couldn't explain." Still more mysterious, reflected the detective. "Do you think he will talk when he gets better?" "I'm afraid not. He seemed quite determined not to tell us anything about himself or about the men who were chasing him." "Don't you remember, Frank," exclaimed Joe, "when we brought him into the house, just as he became conscious again? What was it he said?" "Oh, yes. I had forgotten. He said, 'Snackley got me, the rat,' whatever that meant." "Snackley," exclaimed Fenton Hardy, starting up. "Are you sure he said Snackley? Are you sure that was the name?" "I'm certain. Aren't you, Joe?" "Yes, that was the name, all right." "Well, that does give us something to work on," the detective said. "Probably you have never heard of Snackley, but I have." "Who is he?" asked Frank. "Ganny Snackley is a noted criminal. He is a smuggler, one of the leaders of a ring of smugglers who bring in opium and other drugs from the Orient. Is it possible that he is bringing drugs into the country at Barmet Bay?" 7. Bound and gagged. The Hardy boys were astonished by this information. Their father, tapping a pencil quickly on the desk, leaned forward in his chair. "You may have stumbled on some information of great value," he said to them quietly. "I need hardly tell you that it is best to keep it to yourself. If Ganny Snackley is operating in this vicinity, it will be a great feather in our cap to catch him." "It's an unusual name," remarked Frank. "I'll bet that's the Snackley our man meant, all right." "And the farmer said there was smuggling going on in the bay," Joe pointed out. "Of course, there always has been more or less smuggling carried on in Barmet Bay. But it's been on a small scale. Ganny Snackley and his gang are international smugglers. The last I heard of him, he was operating up on the New England coast. But probably things grew too hot for him and he moved down here. He seems to have dropped completely out of sight for the past 6 months or so. Perhaps this man Jones, at the farmhouse, will talk later on." "I'm going out there to interview him," said Fenton Hardy. "I'll wait a few days until he is feeling better. Of course the matter is one for the United States authorities, and as I haven't been assigned to the case I can't do very much. But perhaps I'll get some information I can use at some other time. Joe and I will go out tomorrow and see how he is getting along." "Do so. But don't ask any questions. Don't let him think you are suspicious of him. Otherwise he'll be liable to sneak away as soon as he can, and we'll lose him altogether. He is under an obligation to you now because you saved his life, so it will seem quite natural for you to come back to see him. If you think he is recovering quickly, let me know and I'll go out right away and talk to him. If you think he will be there for several days yet, we'll just let him stay until he feels better." "Perhaps he is a detective himself," Frank suggested. "That had occurred to me," admitted Mr. Hardy. "If that's the case, I'll keep out of the affair. It's just probable that he is a Secret Service man who discovered Snackley's hangout and was shot for his pains. That would explain why he wouldn't tell you anything about himself. But there's always the possibility that he is one of Snackley's enemies, and in that case I may be able to persuade him to talk." Fenton Hardy asked the boys more questions about their adventure, but beyond a few trivial details they were unable to throw any further light on the mystery. However, it was decided that they should go back to the Kane farmhouse on the following day, which was Sunday, and report on the condition of the mysterious Mr. Jones. With that they left their father, spending the rest of the afternoon in eager discussion and speculation concerning the strange events of the day. It had been an eventful holiday for them, and although they went over the incidents time and again they were unable to arrive at any solution of the puzzling affair in Barmet Bay. As for the happenings at the house on the cliff, they were inclined to accept their father's theory that some practical joker had been to blame. Next morning, after church, they took the motorcycles out of the garage and prepared to ride out to the Kane farmhouse, there to make inquiry as to the condition of the man they had rescued on the previous day. "Remember," warned their father, "don't ask him too many questions or he'll get suspicious. Just find out how long he is likely to remain at the farm. If his injuries aren't very serious he'll be leaving in a day or so and we want to check up on him." The boys promised to follow the detective's instructions. Unlike the day previous, this Sunday was clear and bright, and the rain of the afternoon before had laid the dust so that they enjoyed their journey out along the shore road. "It would be a bad joke on us if Mr. Jones left before we got there," remarked Joe. "I don't think he will. That wound in his side was enough to keep him laid up for a few days. And, anyway, he lost so much blood yesterday that it would take him a while to get back his strength." "I hope he isn't a detective." "Why?" "It would be great if we could get a chance to do some work on this case ourselves. If Ganny Snackley is in this neighborhood and the government detectives don't know of it, we would help Dad land him." "It would be a great chance," admitted Frank. "But I think we'll find our friend Jones is a detective. That is, if we ever find out anything definite about him. Why else should Snackley and his men try to kill him? For there's no doubt they left him for dead. Perhaps he was another smuggler that they wanted to get rid of. Maybe. But I think it's most likely he is a Secret Service man." At length they arrived at the lane leading from the main road to the farmhouse. As their motorcycles roared down the drive they watched for some sign of life about the place. But there was no one in the orchard or in the barnyard. No one came out of the house. The place appeared to be deserted and, although it was a warm day, the doors were closed. "This is queer," remarked Frank, as they brought their motorcycles to a stop and left them in the shade of a large tree near the back of the house. "Mr. and Mrs. Kane couldn't have gone away and left Jones there alone, could they?" The boys went up to the door and rapped. There was no answer. "Try the front door," Joe suggested. After a number of futile efforts, they went to the front door of the farmhouse. But here, although they banged on the panels, there was likewise no response. "They must have gone out," said Joe. "But what about Jones? They wouldn't leave him here alone. I can't understand this. They went to the back door and rapped again and again. Still there was no answer. Frank tried the doorknob and found that the door swung open. They didn't lock the place up, anyway, he said. Let's go in. If Jones is upstairs, we'll go up and see him. Mr. Kane won't mind. Probably they didn't expect callers today. They went into the kitchen, and here they were surprised by the scene of disorder that greeted their gaze. The previous day they had been impressed by the neatness of the room, for Mrs. Kane was evidently the soul of tidiness. Now the kitchen looked as though an earthquake had shaken it. Pots and pans were strewn about the floor. The table had been overturned. A chair lay upside down in a corner. A few cups and saucers lay in shattered bits beside the stove. The woodbox had been upset and the wood was scattered about. One window curtain had been partly torn from its fastenings. What on earth has happened here? Frank exclaimed, in profound astonishment. Looks as if a cyclone came through. There's something queer about this. There's been a fight or a struggle of some kind here. Let's see what the rest of the house looks like. The Hardy boys rushed into the next room. There an unexpected sight met their eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Kane were seated in chairs in the middle of the room. They were unable to move, unable to speak, scarcely able to make a struggle. The farmer and his wife were bound and gagged, tied to their chairs. 8. The stolen witness. Swiftly, the Hardy boys rushed over to Mr. and Mrs. Kane and began to release them. The farmer and his wife had been trussed up by strong ropes, and they had been so well gagged that they had been unable to utter a sound. It was only a matter of a few minutes, however, before their bonds were loosened and the gags removed. "Thank goodness," exclaimed Mrs. Kane, with a sigh of relief, as the gag was taken away. Her husband, spluttering with rage, rose from his chair and hurled the ropes to one side. "What happened?" asked the boys, in amazement. For a moment Mr. and Mrs. Kane were unable to give a coherent account of their experience, owing to the strain they had undergone, but at last the farmer stumbled over to the window and pointed down the shore road. "They went that way," he roared. "That way. Follow them." "Who?" "The rascals that tied us up. They took Jones away with them." "Kidnapped him?" "Yes, kidnapped him. There were 4 of them. They broke in here and tied up my wife and me. Then they went upstairs and carried Jones away with them. They dumped him into an automobile and made a getaway. 4 men. 4 of the ugliest-looking scoundrels you ever laid eyes on." "How long ago?" asked Frank quickly. "They didn't leave 10 minutes ago. If you had been here just a few minutes earlier, you would have met the whole crowd of them." The farmer was angry and excited. "But there's time yet. You can catch 'em." They went down the shore road. "Come on, Joe," shouted Frank. "Let's chase them. They've kidnapped Jones." Joe needed no urging. The Hardy boys left the farmer and his wife rubbing their chafed wrists and ankles and hastened out of the house over to their motorcycles. Within a few seconds the staccato roar of the powerful machines broke out on the still air, and then they went rocking and swaying down the lane out onto the shore road. "Some high-handed proceeding, I'll say," yelled Frank, to make himself heard above the roaring of the motorcycles. "Those rascals ought to be in prison," returned his brother. The boys followed in the direction the farmer had indicated. Frank then recollected that just before they had turned in toward the Kane farm he had seen a cloud of dust down the main road, evidently caused by a speeding automobile, but he had thought nothing of it at the time, for traffic along the shore highway occasioned no comment, especially on Sunday. "If we had only been a little earlier," he groaned. "We'll catch up to them. They haven't much of a start. Maybe we can follow them to some town and have the whole gang arrested." The motorcycles roared along at top speed. Both the Hardy boys were skillful drivers, and for a while Frank was able to follow the course of the car they were pursuing by watching the fresh tread mark in the dust. But when the road came to the place where it intersected with the road leading up to the Morton farm, the treadmark became lost, as evidently another car had turned out of the side road in the meantime and obliterated the fresh tread here and there. They passed the lane that led into the Palukka place and continued on down the shore road until they came to a hilltop that commanded a view of a wide stretch of country. Here they could see the road winding and dipping for a distance of more than a mile, until it was lost to sight in a grove of trees. But there was no sign of the automobile they were seeking. "They've given us the slip, I guess," said Frank, as he brought his motorcycle to a stop. They had a good start and they weren't letting the grass grow under their feet, either. "Think we should keep on?" "There's not much use. We'd better go back to the farmhouse and hear what Mr. and Mrs. Kane have to say about this." They turned their motorcycles about and headed back toward the farm. On the way they discussed the mysterious kidnapping. "Evidently those men in the other motorboat saw us rescue Jones, or else they heard that he had been taken to the farmhouse," remarked Joe. "They must be desperate characters." "I wonder what will happen to poor Jones now," said Frank gravely. "They tried to kill him in the first place. This time. Do you think they'll murder him?" "It looks like that. They didn't show him any mercy out in the bay. They left him for dead that time. Now they'll make sure of it." Joe shuddered. "If they were going to kill him, they'd hardly go to all that bother of kidnapping him," he pointed out. "Perhaps they just want to keep him out of the way. Perhaps they were afraid he would tell about their chasing him and setting fire to his motorboat. They were mighty anxious to get their hands on him, when they would come to the house in broad daylight and tie up Mr. and Mrs. Kane. Gee, it's lucky we came along when we did. They might have been left there for hours without being able to get loose." When they got back to the farmhouse, they found that the farmer and his wife had somewhat recovered from their harrowing experience, although they were still unnerved. Mrs. Kane, ever the true housewife, was already beginning to tidy up the kitchen and living room, for the intruders had upset everything in the struggle. "We lost them," said Frank. Kane nodded. "I didn't think you'd catch them," he said. "They left here in too much of a hurry. But I hoped you would. They had a big, high-powered car and they didn't waste any time getting away." "There were 4 of them, you said?" "4. Ugly villains." "What did they look like?" "I didn't get much of a chance to see. It all happened too quick. One of them came to the door. He was a tall chap with a thin face and asked if I was looking after a man who was almost drowned yesterday. I said that I was, so he told me he had come to take him away, that he was a brother of the fellow. I got kind of suspicious and asked him his name. But in the meantime I had stepped outside the door, and before I knew it, someone jumped at me from behind. I put up a fight as best as I could, but the others came at me from around the corner of the house where they had been hidden, and before I knew it I was tied up. Then they tied up my wife and left us in the living room while they went upstairs." "Did Jones put up a fight when they took him away?" "He tried to. He hollered for help, but of course I couldn't do nothing and he was too weak to fight much himself. They carried him downstairs and put him in the automobile. Then they drove away." "There must be more to this affair than we imagine," reflected Frank. "It's getting serious when they break into a private home like this." "You bet it's gettin' serious," exclaimed the farmer. "It'll be mighty serious for them if they try it again." He motioned to the table where a shotgun was lying. "I've got that gun loaded and waiting for the next gang that tries anything like that. I only wish I'd had it ready this morning." "I don't think you'll have any cause to use it," Frank said reassuringly. "It was Jones they were after. They won't bother you again." "They'd better not. I think the best thing we can do, Joe, is to go right back to Bayport and let Dad know about this." "Good idea. We can't do anything by staying here." "You boys said yesterday that your name was Hardy, eh?" said the farmer. "Ain't any relation to Fenton Hardy, are you?" "He's our father." "The detective?" The Hardy boys nodded assent. Good, exclaimed Kane. You go right back and tell him about this. If anyone can get to the bottom of this affair, it's him. I hate to see them rascals getting away scot-free. Frank and Joe bade goodbye to the farmer and his wife and returned to their motorcycles. They promised to call again at the Kane farm as soon as they had any further information, and Mr. Kane, in turn, gave his promise to notify them if there were any further trace of the kidnappers or of the mysterious Jones. When they returned to Bayport, the boys lost no time in reaching home. Fenton Hardy was enjoying one of his rare afternoons of leisure in reading, but he put his book aside when the boys rushed into the library. Did Mr. Jones talk? He asked quickly, seeing by their expressions that something unusual had happened. We didn't have a chance to see him, exclaimed Joe. What's the matter? Did he clear out? He was kidnapped. Kidnapped? 4 men broke into the farmhouse and took him away, said Frank hurriedly. Then he proceeded to tell the story of the strange events of the morning at the Kane farm, prompted occasionally by Joe. Mr. Hardy was deeply interested. There's only one theory I can think of, he said, at last. This Jones, or whatever his name is, must have belonged to a gang and either squealed on them or threatened to do so. They tried to get rid of him and he escaped in the motorboat, but they thought they had finished him in the explosion. Then they found out that you had rescued him, so they went to the farmhouse and took him away before he had a chance to talk. Do you think they are smugglers? Probably. While you were away this morning, I called up one of the government authorities in the city, and he told me that they believe smugglers are operating in Barmet Bay on a big scale. Did you tell him about Snackley? Mr. Hardy smiled. Not yet. That information, I thought I would keep to myself for the time being. But I wonder if Snackley can be here. It begins to look like it. He is the kind who wouldn't stop at anything from kidnapping to murder. Do the authorities suspect him of being around here? I imagine so. The man I was talking to mentioned the fact that the smugglers they are after are in the drug line. And Snackley is king of the dope smugglers on the Atlantic coast. Gee, I wish we could land him. Of course, said Fenton Hardy, no one has asked us to work on this case, and I don't believe in working for nothing. You mean you won't help? Asked Joe, in disappointment. Fenton Hardy's eyes twinkled as he went on. I don't believe in working for nothing, he repeated. But if we ever caught this man Snackley, it would be worth our while. Why? The reward. Is there a reward offered for him? There has been a standing reward of $5,000 offered for Snackley's capture for some time. And if he is operating in Barmet Bay, as I suspect, it's just possible that we might be able to collect that reward. Good, exclaimed Frank. Let's go after it. 9. The strange message. The Hardy boys expected that the next day would find them busy on a more detailed investigation of the circumstances surrounding the mysterious kidnapping. But, to their surprise, when they came down to breakfast next morning, they found that their father had gone away. Mrs. Hardy could not enlighten them. He went out early this morning and didn't say when he would be back. But he didn't take any baggage with him, so I imagine he hasn't gone very far. He'll probably be back sometime today. Mrs. Hardy was accustomed to the comings and goings of her husband, and nothing surprised her. She realized that his profession demanded that he do many things that were mysterious enough on the surface but reasonable enough when the time came to explain them. But the boys were taken aback, for they had looked forward to seeing their father in the morning and had hoped that he would lay a plan of campaign before them. They went to school in disappointment. On the way they met Callie Shaw and Iola Morton, 2 girls who were particular friends of the boys. Callie Shaw, a brown-eyed, brown-haired girl, was an object of special enthusiasm with Frank, who was apt to cast an appreciative eye upon the other sex, while Iola, a plump, dark girl, a sister of Chet Morton's, was all right, as a girl, in Joe's reluctant opinion. Chet had told his sister about the affair at the Palukka place on the previous Saturday, and she, in turn, had told Callie. "Well, how are the ghost hunters this morning?" asked Callie. "Fine," replied Frank, with a smile. "What a brave bunch of boys you all are," exclaimed the girl. "Running away from an empty house." "That house wasn't empty," put in Joe warmly. "I suppose you think our motorcycle tools walked away." "Somebody played a pretty good practical joke on you. Just wait till you get to school. Whoever played that trick will be sure to tell everybody." "Oh, well, we can stand it. If Chet Morton hadn't been with us at the time, I would have blamed him. It's like one of his pet ideas." "He can prove an alibi this time," said Iola. "He was right with you, and by the way he talked when he got home, I think he was as badly frightened as anyone." But when the boys reached school, they found that although news of their experience at the house on the cliff had preceded them, no one was laying claim to having originated the joke. Chet and the other boys had told of the escapade, but although they momentarily expected that some practical jester would come forward and take credit for the whole affair, nothing of the sort happened, and when noon came it was as much a mystery as ever. "I'm beginning to think it wasn't a joke at all," admitted Joe, on the way home. "Believe me, if it had been a trick played on us, the fellow who did it wouldn't have lost any time coming around to have the horse laugh. It was a little too well done to be a joke. I think someone started this ghost rumor just to keep people away from the Palukka place. If everybody gets the same reception we got, I don't blame 'em for staying away. What with weird yells and shrieks, with walls falling in and toolboxes being robbed, it's a mighty active ghost they have on the job." "I wonder, could it have anything to do with the smugglers, Joe?" The Hardy boys looked at one another. "There's a thought," exclaimed Joe. "We had two mighty strange things happen to us on the same day. Perhaps they have something to do with each other. It might be only a coincidence. But when you come to think of it, that house on the cliff would be a mighty handy hangout for smugglers if they could keep strangers away. And what better way than by starting a story that the place is haunted? Gosh, I never thought of that. I wonder what Dad thinks of it. Perhaps he's at home now. We'll mention it to him." But when they returned home for lunch, they found that Fenton Hardy had not come back. Neither was he at home when school closed for the day, and when the Hardy boys went to bed that night, there had not been the slightest word from their father nor any indication of where he had gone. In spite of the fact that they were accustomed to these sudden absences, the lads felt vaguely uneasy. "I don't know why," said Frank next morning, "but I have a sort of feeling that everything isn't all right." "I've been feeling that way myself. Of course, Dad has often gone away from home like this without telling where he was going, and he has always turned up all right. But this time... well, we'll just have to wait and see. He knows his own business best, and it's 10 chances to 1 we're worrying over nothing, but I have a sort of a hunch that there's a nigger in the woodpile." Mrs. Hardy, however, was not alarmed. "Oh, he'll walk into the house when we're least expecting him," she laughed reassuringly. "You boys are just anxious to get to work on the Snackley case. Perhaps that's what he's working on now. He'll probably come back with a lot of information." "We'd rather he'd let us in on that," returned Joe. "And keep you out of school. Oh, no. He doesn't mind letting you do detective work as long as it's in your spare time." So the Hardy boys had to make the best of it. They concealed their impatience during the remainder of the week, doing their schoolwork faithfully. The following week was the start of vacation, and the lads were deep in examinations for several days, so that they had not much time to think of detective activities. But on Friday afternoon, the mystery of their father's absence took a strange turn. They came back from school to find their mother sitting in the living room, carefully examining a note that she had evidently just received. "Come here, boys," she said, as they came into the room. "I want you to look at this and tell me what you think of it." She handed the note over to Frank. "What is it?" he asked, quickly. "Word from Dad?" "It's supposed to be." The Hardy boys read the note. It was written in pencil on a torn sheet of paper, and the handwriting seemed to be that of Fenton Hardy. The note read, "I won't be home for several days. Don't worry." It was signed by the detective. That was all. There was nothing to indicate where he was, nothing to show when the note had been written. "When did you get this?" asked Frank. "It came in the afternoon mail. It was addressed to me, and the envelope had a Bayport postmark." "What is there to worry about?" Joe asked. "It's better than not hearing from him at all." "But I'm not sure that it's from him." "Why?" "Your father has an arrangement with me that he would always put a secret sign beneath his signature any time he had occasion to write to me like this. He was always afraid of people forging his name to letters and notes like this and perhaps getting papers or information that they shouldn't. So we arranged this sign that he would always put beneath his name." Frank snatched up the note again. "And there's no sign here. Just his signature." "It may be his signature. If it isn't, it is a very good forgery. And it may have been that he forgot to put in the secret sign, although it isn't like him to do that." Mrs. Hardy was plainly worried. "If he didn't write it, then who did?" asked Joe. "Your father has many enemies. There are relatives of criminals whom he has had arrested, and there are criminals who have served their terms and have been released. If there has been foul play, the note might be meant to keep us from being suspicious and delay any search." "Foul play!" exclaimed Frank. "You don't think something has happened to Dad?" he added, his face showing his alarm. "The fact that he didn't put the secret sign underneath his name makes me anxious. What other object could anyone have in sending us a note like that, if not to keep us from starting a search for him?" "Well, whether he wrote that note or not, we will start a search for him," declared Frank firmly. "He merely said not to worry about him. He didn't order us not to look for him. If he really did write the note, he can't say we were disobeying instructions. And then, the absence of the secret sign makes it all different." "I'll say we'll look for him," cried Joe. "Vacation starts next week, and we'll have plenty of time to hunt for him." "Wait until then, at any rate," Mrs. Hardy advised. "Perhaps he will return in the meanwhile." But as she glanced at the note again and once more regarded the signature, strangely lacking its secret sign, her forebodings that Fenton Hardy had met with foul play increased. The vain search. Fenton Hardy was still missing when the summer vacation began. There had been no word from him. Never, in all his years of detective work, had he vanished from home so completely and for such a length of time. He was an intensely considerate man, and his first thought was always for his wife and boys. Occasionally it was necessary for him to leave home suddenly on trips that would keep him away for some length of time. Sometimes it seemed wiser to keep the knowledge of his whereabouts to himself. But he always managed to communicate with Mrs. Hardy to assure her of his safety. But this time, with the exception of the dubious note, there had been no such assurance. From the moment he had left the house on the morning after the kidnapping at the Kane farmhouse, he had vanished as utterly as though the earth had swallowed him up. The Hardy boys questioned many people in and around Bayport, but no one recollected having seen their father on the day in question. At the railway station they ascertained the fact that the detective had not bought a train ticket that day or any day since. The agent admitted it was barely possible that Fenton Hardy might have taken a train and paid his fare on board, but said it was not likely. Inquiries at the steamboat office brought a similar response. The detective had not been seen. None of the local police officers remembered having seen Mr. Hardy that morning. The detective was a well-known figure in Bayport, and it seemed strange that no one had seen him about the streets of the city, in spite of the fact that he had left home at an early hour. The boys questioned everyone who was likely to have seen him, even to milkmen who might have been on their routes at that time, but the further they pursued their inquiries, the deeper the mystery became. One of the boys greatly interested in the disappearance of Mr. Hardy was Perry Robinson. Perry was the son of Henry Robinson, who had once gotten into difficulties over the disappearance of some valuables, as related in the Tower Treasure. All of the Hardys had done much for the Robinson family, and the Robinsons were correspondingly grateful. "I saw your dad on the street one day, boys," said Perry. "He waved his hand to me." "When was that?" demanded Frank quickly. "Oh, a day or two before you say he disappeared." "Gee, fellows, I wish I could help you," went on Perry. "Well, keep your eyes open, and if you learn anything let us know," said Joe, and to this Perry readily agreed. Shortly after the boys had had their talk with Perry Robinson, they ran into a number of their girl friends. One of these girls had likewise seen Mr. Hardy, but after considerable questioning the boys came to the conclusion that the meeting had taken place several days before their father's disappearance. "Oh, I'm so sorry this happened," said one of the girls, and the others nodded in sympathy. The Hardy boys extended the search beyond the city. It occurred to them that their father might have gone out to the cane farm, and they made their way to that place. But the farmer and his wife said no one had called at the house since the eventful Sunday of the kidnapping. "They've left us in peace, praise be," declared Mrs. Kane. "No one's been near the house since those rascals went away." The boys gave the kindly couple a description of their father, but Mr. Kane could not recollect having seen anyone resembling Mr. Hardy near the farm at any time within the past week. He had been working in the fields, he said, and would probably have noticed any strangers on the road. So the boys returned to Bayport, puzzled and downhearted over the failure of their search. They could not imagine where Fenton Hardy could have gone if he had not been near the cane farm. "Something has happened to him, I'm sure," said Frank. "It isn't like Dad to stay away this long without sending some word." Perhaps he did write that note. He would have explained a little more. And he would have put in the secret sign. The fact that the Hardy boys were searching for their father gradually became known throughout Bayport, and one evening a thick-set, broad-shouldered man presented himself at the front door of the Hardy home and asked for the boys. Mrs. Hardy bade him step inside and he waited in the hall, nervously twisting his cap in his hands. When Frank and Joe came out, the stranger introduced himself as Sam Bates. "I'm a truck driver," he told them. "The reason I came around to see you was because I heard you were looking for your father." "Have you seen him?" asked Frank eagerly. Sam Bates shuffled his feet and looked dubiously at the floor. "Well, I have and I haven't, you might say," he observed. "I did see your father quite a few days ago, but where he is now, I couldn't tell you, for I don't know." Sam was evidently not a man of gigantic intellect. He spoke slowly and painstakingly, and his most obvious statements were delivered with the gravity suitable to pearls of wisdom. "Where did you see him?" "I'm a truck driver, see?" "Yes, you told us that," said Frank impatiently. "But where did you see our father?" Sam Bates was not to be hurried. He had a story to tell and he was bound to tell it. "I'm a truck driver, see," he repeated. "Mostly I drive just in and around Bayport, but sometimes they give me a run out to some of them villages. That's how I come to be out there that morning." "Out where?" "I'm coming to that. I just forget what day it was, but I think it was about a week from last Monday. I know it was just after Sunday because when I went home to dinner that day the wife was washing clothes and dinner was late and I had to eat it out on the back steps anyway for the kitchen was all in a mess. You know how it is on wash day." Sam Bates regarded them wistfully, as though hoping for some expression of sympathy and understanding. But the Hardy boys were eager for information, and impatient with the worthy truck driver's circuitous method of telling his story. "But what has this got to do with our father?" demanded Joe. "I'm coming to that, see? Give me time. Give me time. As I was saying, I'm pretty sure it was on a Monday, for it was wash day, and the wife never washes except on Monday. I mean, she never washes clothes except on Monday. She herself, why, she washes every day, of course. Anyway, it was Monday. That was the day Dad disappeared, prompted Frank. You don't say. Well, I saw him that day. Where? I'm coming to that. As I was saying, it was Monday, and when I went down to the garage, the boss, he says to me, says he, Sam, I want you to run a truckload of furniture down the shore road. So I said, well, boss, I guess that's what I'm here for. So he told me that this here load of furniture had to go to one of them farmhouses away down near the point. So we loaded the truck and I filled her up with gas and away I went. It must have been about 9 o'clock by then, I guess. And you went down the shore road? Sure. And it was a nice morning for driving too. Anyway, I went out past the Tower Mansion, you know, Herd Applegate's place, them people you and your father got back the Tower treasure for, and I was driving along without a care in the world and whistling away, quite happy like, when I sees that I was coming near that haunted house up on the cliff. You know, the place where old Palaka was murdered. The Palaka place? Yeah. Well, anyway, I was coming by there and I didn't drive slow either, for they say there's ghosts in that place and I ain't taking no chance with nothing like that, so the truck was going along at quite a clip, when what should I see but a man walking along the road. Dad. Yeah, it was your father. Well, anyway, nobody ever said Sam Bates wouldn't give a guy a lift, so I slows down a bit and I says, hey, do you want a ride? Just like that, see? Then this guy turned around so I seen who it was. I didn't know until then, see? So when I seen who it was I said, good day, Mr. Hardy, would you like a lift? But he thanked me and said he was just taking a little walk. So I drove on past him and the last I seen of him he was walking along beside the road. Did he go down the lane to the Palaka place? I dunno whether he did or not. He hadn't quite reached the lane when I seen him last. But I didn't meet him on my way back, so I don't know where he went. Matter of fact, I didn't think nothing more of it until this morning when a bunch of the boys were sitting around the garage talking and one of them said that you two lads had been hunting all over the city for your old man, I mean your father, and you couldn't find him. So I says to myself, Sam, meb you can tell 'em something they don't know. So I just thought I'd come up. And we're very grateful to you, Frank assured him. You've given us some valuable information. We didn't know whether our father had gone out of the city or not. Now I think we'll know where to look for him. Ain't any chance of him nosing around that Palaka place, is there? Asked Bates. It's a mighty good place to stay away from if everything you hear is true. It's haunted, that place is. Oh, that wouldn't matter to him. But I'm glad you told us about seeing him. It gives us a better idea of where to look for him. Well, I'm glad if I've helped any. Guess I'll be going now, said Sam Bates, putting on his cap. I hope your dad shows up all right. The Hardy boys thanked him warmly and Bates shambled away, his hands in his pockets. Mrs. Hardy came into the hallway. Any news? She asked anxiously. We have a clue, anyway, Frank told her. That fellow says he saw Dad on the shore road the morning he left here. Where was he? Near the old Palaka place. The house on the cliff. Frank nodded. Mrs. Hardy looked grave. Surely he couldn't have gone there and disappeared, she said. I can't imagine why he would go to the house on the cliff, anyway, observed Joe. Oh, I know now, Mrs. Hardy exclaimed. I had forgotten all about it. I intended to tell you boys, but somehow it slipped my mind. Now that you mention the Palaka place, I remember. What was it? Your father discovered something about Snackley, the smuggler. It seems that Snackley was related to Felix Palaka, the miser. Related to him. He was a cousin or nephew, or something of the sort. One of the government men told him that. So your father had an idea that Palaka must have been visited by Snackley at some time or another, and that Snackley must have got the idea of using Barmet Bay for his smuggling operations at that time. Phew, exclaimed Joe. Now we're getting on the right track. Dad must have gone up to the house on the cliff to investigate. Why didn't we think of searching there before? Dad put 2 and 2 together and figured that there might be some connection between the queer things that happened at the Palaka place the day we visited it and the case of that fellow Jones whom we rescued. Then, when he learned that Snackley was related to Palaka, he was sure of it. It's as clear as daylight. But what on earth could have happened to him? Let's go up to the Palaka place and find out. But Mrs. Hardy interposed. Her lips were firm. Promise me you won't go alone. Why not, Mother? We can look after ourselves. If anything has happened to your father, I don't want you to run the same risk. But we must go up there and look the place over again. Get some of the boys to go with you. I guess it would be safer, agreed Joe. We can round up a bunch of the fellows and go up there tomorrow morning. We'll search that place from top to bottom this time. Mrs. Hardy gave her consent to this plan, and the boys thereupon set out to find their chums and tell them of the proposed trip. Although 2 or 3 of the boys backed out when they learned that the destination was to be the haunted house, the majority were willing enough, and by nightfall all was in readiness for the journey on the morrow. 11. The cap on the peg. Next morning the searching party set out. Jerry Gilroy had not got over the scare he had received on the remarkable Saturday of the boys' first visit to the house on the cliff, and he did not show up. But Chet Morton and Biff Hooper appeared, with Phil Cohen and Tony Prito, 2 more of the Hardy boys' chums at the Bayport High School. Chet had his motorcycle and the party left the Hardy home shortly after breakfast, each machine carrying 2. Before they left, Frank explained the situation fully to the others. We know that Dad was last seen near the Palaka place, and we have every reason to believe that he left here with the intention of searching the house. He hasn't shown up since and no person has seen him, so there may have been foul play. If there is any trace of him around the Palaka place we'll find it, declared Chet. It will take a mighty lively ghost to scare us away this time. The 3 motorcycles went out of Bayport past the Tower Mansion, sped along the shore road. There was little talk among the boys. Each realized that this was not a pleasure outing but a serious mission, and each recognized the importance of it. The Hardy boys had every confidence in their companions. Chet and Biff, they knew, would not be as easily frightened on this occasion, and as for Phil and Tony, they were noted at school for their fearless, at times even reckless, dispositions. They passed the Kane farmhouse, nestling among the trees, and at last came in sight of the gloomy cliff that rose from Barmet Bay and at the summit of which perched the rambling stone house where the miser, Felix Palaka, had met his death. Lonely-looking place, isn't it? Remarked Phil, who was sharing Frank's motorcycle. It was an ideal place for a murder. When Felix Palaka lived there, I doubt if he had more than 2 or 3 visitors in a year. How did he get his food and supplies? He used to drive into the city about once a week in a rattly old buggy, with a horse that must have come out of the ark. The poor animal looked as if it hadn't had a square meal in a lifetime. Palaka must have been a little bit crazy. How he lived alone up there all the time, nobody could understand. He worked hard enough and he made the farm pay. No one could drive a better bargain when it came to selling his hay and grain. Phil looked with interest at the old grey house that could be seen more clearly now that they were approaching it. When they were still some distance from the lane, however, Frank brought his motorcycle to a stop and signaled to the others to do likewise. "What's the idea?" Chet asked. We'd better sneak up on the place quietly. If we go any farther they'll hear the motorcycles, that is, if there is anyone at the place. We'll leave them here under the trees and go ahead on foot. The motorcycles were accordingly hidden in a clump of bushes beside the road, and the 6 boys went on toward the lane. We'll separate here, Frank decided. 3 of us will take one side of the lane and the rest will take the other side. Keep to the bushes as much as possible, and when we get near the house lay low for a while and watch the place. When I whistle we can come out from under cover and go on up to the house. That's a good plan, approved Tony. Joe and Biff and I will go on the left side of the road. Good. Chet and Phil and I will take the other side. Remember to keep out of sight of the house as much as possible. The boys entered the lane, then separated according to the agreement they had made. One group plunged into the weeds and undergrowth at the edge of the lane on one side, while the others pushed into the bushes at the opposite side. In a few minutes each group was lost to view, and only an occasional snapping and crackling of branches indicated their presence in the heavy undergrowth that flanked the lane. Frank advanced cautiously. The brushwood was much deeper than he had anticipated, and they made slow progress, for he was desirous of creeping up on the house with as little noise as possible. The undergrowth was thick and hampered their movements. They made their way forward, step by step, keeping well in from the lane, and after about 10 minutes Frank raised his hand as a warning to the others. Through the dense thickets he had caught a glimpse of the house. They went on cautiously until they reached the edge of the bushes, and there they crouched behind the screen of leaves, peeping out at the gloomy old stone building in the clearing. But at the first glance, an expression of surprise crossed Frank's face. The Palaka house was evidently occupied. The weeds that had overgrown the yard on their last visit had been completely cleared away, the grass had been cut and the tumble-down fence had been repaired. The gate, which had been hanging by one hinge, had been fixed and the grass along the pathway had been trimmed. A similar change had overtaken the house. There was glass in all the windows and the boards had been removed. The front door had been repaired and the steps had been mended. Smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. "There must be someone living here," whispered Chet. Frank was puzzled. He had not heard that anyone had taken the Palaka house. On account of the unenviable fame of the place, it was hardly likely that a new tenant could move in without arousing considerable comment in Bayport. But this had evidently happened. For a while the boys remained at the edge of the bushes watching the place. Then they saw a woman come out to the clothesline at the back of the house. She carried a basket of clothes, and these she began hanging up on the line. Shortly afterward a man came out, strode across the yard to the woodshed and began chopping wood. The boys looked at one another in consternation. They had expected to find the same sinister and deserted place they had visited previously. Instead, they had arrived on a scene of domestic peace and comfort. They could not understand it. "Not much use staying in hiding," whispered Frank. "Let's get together and walk right up and question these people." He gave a low whistle, then emerged from the bushes into the lane. His companions followed. In a short time they were joined by Joe and the other boys. All were deeply puzzled by the remarkable change that had come over the Palaka place. "This beats anything I ever heard of," declared Joe. "It looks as if some farmer has taken the place, but it's queer we hadn't heard of it. Everybody in Bayport would be talking about it if they knew someone had nerve enough to take over the Palaka farm." I'm not satisfied yet, Frank said. We'll go up and question these people. Accordingly, the 6 boys walked boldly out of the lane and across the yard. The man in the woodshed saw them first and put down his axe, staring at them with an expression of annoyance on his face. The woman at the clothesline heard their footsteps and turned, facing them, her hands upon her hips. She was hard-faced and tight-lipped, with gaunt features. She was not prepossessing, and her untidy garb did not impress the boys favorably. "What do you want?" demanded the man, emerging from the woodshed. He was short and thin with close-cropped hair, and he was in need of a shave. His complexion was swarthy and he had narrow eyes under coarse, black brows. His manner was far from polite as he advanced upon the boys. At the same time, another man came out of the kitchen and stood on the steps. He was stout and red-haired and had a thick mustache. As he stood there in his shirt sleeves, he glared pugnaciously at the sextet. "Yeah, what's the big idea?" he asked. "We didn't know anyone was living here," explained Frank, edging over to the kitchen door. He wanted to get a look inside the house if possible. "Well, there is," said the red-haired man. "We're living here now, and I can't see that it's any of your business. What are you snooping around here for?" "We aren't snooping," said Frank quietly. "We are looking for a man who has disappeared from Bayport." "Humph," grunted the woman. "What makes you think he might be around here?" asked the red-headed man. "He was last seen in this neighborhood." "What's his name?" "Hardy." "What does he look like?" "Tall and dark. He was wearing a gray suit and a gray cap." "Ain't been nobody around here since we moved in," said the red-headed man gruffly. "No, we didn't see him," snapped the woman. "You boys had better go and look somewhere else." There was nothing to be gained by arguing with the unsociable trio, so the boys started to leave. But Frank, who had edged close to the open door during the course of the conversation, had glanced into the kitchen and something had caught his eye. It was a gray cap, hanging on a peg. 12. Pointed questions. Frank thought quickly. He must ascertain the truth. The cap, he was almost sure, was the one his father had worn on the morning he had left home. But he wanted to look at it closely, because he knew he might be mistaken and that it would not do to make any accusations unless he were sure of his ground. "I'm very thirsty," he said quickly. "Do you mind if I have a drink?" Redhead and the woman looked at one another without enthusiasm. It was plain that they wished to get rid of their visitors as soon as possible. But they could not refuse such an innocent and reasonable request. "Come into the kitchen," said Redhead grudgingly. This was just what Frank wanted. He followed the man into the kitchen of the Palaka place. Redhead pointed to a water tap. A dipper was hanging from a nail nearby. "Go ahead," he grunted. Frank went over to the tap, and as he did so he passed the cap on the peg. He took a swift look at the cap. He had made no mistake. It was his father's. Then he received a shock that almost stunned him. For a second he almost stopped in his tracks, but then he recollected himself and moved mechanically on toward the tap. He had seen bloodstains. On the lower edge of the cap were 3 large stains, reddish in color. They could have been made by nothing but blood. In a daze, Frank turned on the water, filled the dipper and drank. At last he turned away, conscious that Redhead had been eyeing him carefully all the time. "Thanks," he said, and again cast a glance at the peg. The cap was gone. Redhead had undoubtedly snatched it away and hidden it. Frank gave no sign that he noticed anything amiss, and walked out of the kitchen into the yard, where he rejoined the others. "I guess we may as well be going," he said. "You might as well," snapped the woman. There's been no strangers around here. We're sorry we troubled you, said Joe. Goodbye. Redhead grunted a curt farewell. The woman and the other man said nothing as the boys turned away and retraced their steps out to the lane. For a while they walked on in silence, and then, when they were out of sight of the house, Frank turned to the others. Do you know why I went into the kitchen? He asked. Why? They demanded eagerly, and Joe put in. I thought there was something fishy about the way you asked for that drink. What did you see? I saw Dad's cap hanging on a peg. This caused an immediate sensation. Phil Cohen whistled in amazement. Then he has been here. They were lying. Are you sure it was Dad's cap? Asked Joe. Positive. I'd recognize it anywhere. And more than that, there were bloodstains on it. Bloodstains? Frank nodded. The boys looked at one another in silence. This is serious, declared Joe finally. We can't let them get away with this. I'll say we can't, agreed Chet. Let's go back. I was going to argue it out right there and then, but I thought I'd better tell the rest of you first so that you'd know what it was all about, Frank explained. He may have been, Joe left the sentence unfinished. He may have been murdered, said Frank firmly, and we're going to find out about it. What do you think we'd better do? I think we'd better go back and tell them we saw that cap and ask how it got there. That'll force a showdown. They don't like us any too well as it is, so we won't have to be over polite to them. The boys held a council, and it was unanimously agreed that the matter should not be dropped. Each was of the opinion that the trio now occupying the house on the cliff were far from savory, and that the fact of Fenton Hardy's cap being seen in the kitchen was a clue of first-rate importance. He snatched the cap away when my back was turned, went on Frank. That shows there is something wrong, Chet affirmed. We'll go back and tackle him right away. No time like the present. Let's go. The boys accordingly started back down the lane toward the house. When they emerged into the yard again, they found the two men and the woman standing together by the shed, talking earnestly. The boys were almost up to them before the woman caught sight of them and spoke warningly to the red-headed man. What do you want now? Demanded Redhead, in a surly manner, as he advanced. We want to know about that cap in the kitchen, said Frank firmly. What cap? There's no cap in there. There isn't now, but there was. It's a grey cap and it was hanging in there when I went in for a drink. I don't know anything about no cap, persisted Redhead. Perhaps you want us to ask the police up to help us find out, put in Tony Preto cheerfully. Redhead glanced meaningly at the woman. The other man stepped forward. I know the cap he means, he said. It's mine. What about it? It isn't yours, and you know it, declared Frank. That cap belongs to the man we're looking for. I tell you it is my cap, snapped the swarthy man, showing his yellow teeth in a snarl. Don't tell me I'm lying. Redhead stepped forward diplomatically. You're mistaken, Klein, he said. I know the cap they mean. That's the one I found on the road a few days ago. You found it? Asked Frank incredulously. Sure, I found it. A grey cap with bloodstains on it. That's the one. But why did you hide it when I went into the kitchen? Well, to tell the truth, them bloodstains made me nervous. I didn't know but what there might be some trouble come of it, so I thought I'd better keep that cap out of sight. Where did you find it? Joe demanded. About a mile from here. On the shore road. Yes. It was lying right in the middle of the road. When was this? A couple of days ago, just after we moved in here. Let's see the cap, suggested Chet Morton. We want to make sure of this. Redhead moved reluctantly toward the kitchen. The woman sniffed. "I don't see why you're making all this fuss about an old cap," she said. "Coming around at this hour of the day disturbing honest folk." "We're sorry to disturb you," said Joe. "But this is a serious matter." Redhead emerged from the house holding the cap in one hand. He tossed it over to the boys. They examined it eagerly. Frank turned back the inside flap and there he found what he was looking for, the initials FH imprinted in indelible ink on the leather band. "It's Dad's cap, all right." "I don't like the look of those bloodstains," said Joe, in a low voice. "He must have been badly hurt." To tell the truth, the inside of the cap gave evidence that the wearer had been severely injured, for the bloodstains were of large extent. The boys examined them gravely. "Are you sure you found this on the road?" Frank asked doubtfully. "You don't think I'd lie about it, do you?" "We can't very well contradict you. I don't mind telling you that we're going to turn this over to the police. This man has disappeared, and by the appearance of this cap he has met with foul play. If you know anything about it you'd better speak up now." "He doesn't know anything about it," shrilled the woman angrily. "Go away and don't bother us. Didn't he tell you he found the cap on the road? Why should he know anything more about it than that?" "We're going to take the cap with us." "Take it," snapped Redhead. "I don't want it." The boys turned away. Nothing further was to be gained by questioning the trio in the yard, and at any rate the lads had gained possession of the cap. "We'd better go," said Frank in a low voice. They went back toward the lane. As they entered it they cast a last glance back at the yard. The woman and the two men were standing just where they had left them. The woman was motionless, her hands on her hips. Redhead was standing with his arms folded and the swarthy man was leaning on the axe. All three were gazing intently and silently after the departing boys.